Hello everyone, DM Gashbad here, and we are doing something a little bit different today. We're going to go way back and we're going to take a look at my very first miniatures wargaming army, my old Rogue Trader era Ork army. A little bit of history for you. I was introduced to this game back in '91, I want to say. I was in high school in California and a guy moved into the area from Minnesota and he introduced me to the old Rogue Trader book and I thought it was awesome. So I looked through the book, we played a couple of practice games, he gave me a couple of the old RTB-01 Space Marines for me to paint, and I thought that was all pretty cool, but eventually I wanted to have an army of my own. And back then, of course, number one, I was very poor, and number two, you didn't really have as many choices as you do now. Because I didn't have a whole lot of money, I knew I had to start with one of the plastic sets, which were actually pretty good back then, but there were only a few of them. You had the old Space Marines, you had Imperial Guard, you had squats, and boy, that would have been a different experience. But you also had the Orks. So those were only the really four. The plastic Gene Stealers and Tyranids, they came a lot later. It took forever to get plastic Eldar. So it had to be one of those, and I picked the Orks. Really, they were the only alien species. They had a cool vibe, the sort of Mad Max, rough and ready, crude style going on with them. And just generally, they're kind of funny. They were different than the rest of them. I mean, all of that old Warhammer 40k stuff was kind of sarcastic and tongue-in-cheek. But the Orks especially had this sort of dark comedy about them. So we're going to take a look at those guys right now. Let's go all the way to that plastic set. Here you can see some of those guys right there. You could equip them with a bunch of different stuff. Those old kits had a lot of options. But your main choice that you had to make was you could fit them with these bolt guns. They weren't called shooters back then. They were just regular bolt guns for long range fire, which they were actually pretty good at. Or you could fit them with bolt pistols and make a hand-to-hand combat mob. I mostly went with bolt guns for my guys because I thought they were cool. I thought the big guns looked interesting. Here, in fact, this guy is the very first guy that I painted. And as you can tell, he's really, really ugly. I think I borrowed my friend's dark green paint for this guy, and the choice of colors is bad. I chose sort of an all brown costuming color scheme. And so he's not great, but I do have him still in the army. Eventually I got my own paints, and I changed the color of the orc skin to this lighter green, which I still use for my fantasy orcs. I'll get back to this guy in a little bit. But I kept some of these dark green guys throughout the army, just to tie in some of the guys that I initially painted, and also just for a little bit of variety. I thought sizes and skin tones and stuff would vary across a 40k army, and so I was just fine with that. Before we get too far into the details, I'm going to just briefly talk about the basing. As you can tell, listen, this was a long time ago. Things were primitive back then. I was primitive, and that's going to come up over and over again. So this is just regular sand glued onto the base. And first off, I thought it looked fine. It was cheap, it was quick, and it looked like rocks, so I thought it was completely appropriate. Also, the gaming group that we eventually developed, they had this really bizarre idea. They were going to make a modular table, but in like the worst possible way. They just took like an 8x4 sheet of plywood and cut it all up into 1 foot squares and then just covered it. They had a flock one and they had just like this gravel one that was just covered with sand. It was a weird choice. It was really heavy. It looked weird because it was all, the table itself was all divided up into these 1 foot squares. It wasn't really convenient to store. I mean, I guess it was more convenient than just hauling around a giant board, but if we just divided it up into like 2x4 pieces, which I generally do nowadays, I think it would have been better. And it didn't take advantage of one of the big aspects of modularity, which was we didn't, carve out any special terrain features. We didn't, we had some segments with roads and stuff like that, but really it was almost entirely just flat squares. So it was an odd choice, but these bases fit perfectly with it because it was just sand glued on plywood, and this is just sand glued on bases. So for the time, it was fine. As I started painting and developing my army, I decided it needed a backstory. So I chose to call these guys the Explosive Phlegm tribe because back in high school, I thought that was particularly funny. And really, if you read some of those old 40k orc stories, it's not exactly off-brand to have sort of this crude humor involving, just in this case, like mucus, phlegm, other bodily functions, stuff like that. And I thought it was just kind of a funny idea that this was a group of remote orcs that had just a minor mutation where their mucus was slightly explosive. That there is my war boss. I eventually painted him up a while later, but we'll start with him, why not? That is Badreg Phlegmwad of Waa-Phlegmwad. So this these use these, let's see, this is the Rogue Trader era, so we used these two books right here. Here We Go and Freebooters. These are fantastic books. It was so hard to move away from these to second and third edition because they had so much stuff, so many cool ideas. I always said, Orcs would never get as much in any other edition as they had in those early Rogue Trader days. And I think I was right. I don't think they ever achieved quite as much stuff as they had back then. Speaking of editions of the game, I'm just going to be jumping from topic to topic, story to story, in no particular order here. We played a lot of first edition 40k, Rogue Trader. We played a decent amount of second edition. I think I played one game of third edition. It just didn't catch us. By that time, we had kind of moved on to fantasy, and the things that we were hoping from third edition didn't exactly happen. A big problem that I had with the game is that we were not sophisticated players. We would often just play games until one side or the other was dead. So we would go until the very last model, and so it would bog down to something like a screamer killer chasing a tank or something like that. So big, tough models were really valuable, and infantry was almost meaningless. That didn't quite sit right with me because I did like my little orc infantry. If you were thinking to yourself, that sounds like a really dumb way to play the game, you're right. If you think that must have taken a really long time, yeah, you're absolutely right. We played, like all night on some of these games. Speaking of the rules themselves, I understand there's this nostalgic movement towards old games like this, and I think that's fantastic. And I love having this game. I love that I don't have to kind of recapture that time in my life. I don't have to go and hunt down these models and repaint this kind of stuff. But that said, I don't think I have any interest in ever playing a game of Rogue Trader 40k again. Those rules, and I know I've said this a lot recently, but those rules were a mess, and not really in a good way. They were really confusing and really unbalanced. We had like 4 pages of handwritten house rules just to make the game work. And of course, it didn't help that we were young and we were competitive and just kind of high school age jerks. But with all that said, it was a lot of fun. I do like this old army. Let's go and take a closer look at it right now. So when I first started, I got the old plastic box set for the Ork boys, and I think it came with like 36 orcs, and I just glued them together in whatever way I felt like. And so as I actually learned the rules of the game, I had to sort out this random collection of models I had assembled into an actual army, which isn't the best way of putting together a force. And I think we'll find out why. So anyway, I had a bunch of these guys with the bolters, and so those made my big mob, the Explosive Phlegm big mob that you can see right here. So as you can see, these old plastic guys are really cool. There's 2 different bodies, the hunched over one and the more upright one, and a bunch of different heads, and just lots of random little bits that you can add on guys. So my very first guy, I took it really easy on the extra bits. I just used the basic stuff, and he looks really plain and uninteresting. But as you can see, you can add shoulder pads, and this is a stick bomb, but I didn't know what it was at the time, so I just kind of added like a flashlight to his head. Here are some axes. You can either hold them. I stuck this guy on his bolter just because I thought it was cool. You can see here we've got the symbol that I decided to go with. It's just an explosion with little bits of green phlegm in there. So there's a little mushroom cloud. There's like a little splatter. Just different variations of that. on their shoulder pads. And I trimmed down the number of colors I used. So we're looking at a blue, a red, and the green brown. And that's more or less it. You can see here we have more of the same guys. Again, experimenting with different stuff. Here's an old fantasy shield that I stuck on one for no real good reason. Here I made a Mad Max style one by just sticking toothpicks on his shoulder pads. I like this conversion a lot. Just stuck an axe blade on his head because, we're not far removed from the 80s. I thought it was cool. And there are certain conversions that I made that really stood out to my opponents. So some of them went through the game with the specific intention to kill off some of my models, some distinctive ones. One of those is this vomiting guy right here. The Screaming Orc head was really useful. I had a lot of conversions with him. This guy, I just stuck a glob of hot glue into his mouth when I was putting them together, and then glued some sand on it, and then painted like he got attacked by some sort of gas bomb or something like that. So he's charging forward while he's puking, and I put binoculars on his back, just because why not? And so that was one guy that was a target of my friend's attacks. The other one is this guy, he's so mad. He got his arm blown off, but he's still really angry. He's screaming at you. He's still going to come kill you. Those are those guys. Eventually I found out that hand-to-hand combat was the way to go for orcs, and so I managed to acquire enough chainswords to actually make a chainsword unit. Here's the old RTB-01 Space Marine Commander head being held in the arm that usually cradles the bolt gun. And so I've got him. Of course, the only bit of painted base that I have would be these little blood splatters that I leave on some of these guys. You can see some of these guys were painted a lot later than some of the others. Like this is a more recent one. And you can see I'm developing my painting style a little bit more, adding more highlights, making them a little bit more extreme. But the basics are always kind of there. Back in those days, I did a brush-on undercoat in white. So I took white paint, barely thinned it down, and just brushed it over the whole model, thinking that would help it stick. And then I went and blacklined the whole model. So all the different places where the colors are separated, I painted it black. And then I did kind of a color by number thing, just filling in the colors. And then generally everything got 3 highlights. As time went on, I think that got increased to 5, and I started adding washes, and that's pretty much where my painting is now. But that is the progression that we have all laid out in this here force. What you really need in an orc force is you need your war boss or warlord. And honestly, I forgot what I had right here. There is my guy right there, Badreg Phlegmwad. I was told at one point that the little tinfoil type stuff from wine bottles made for good banners, so I tried doing that there. I don't like it. I switched just to paper eventually, but I do like the design on this. As crude as some of this stuff is, as crude as some of the paint jobs are, I do like some of the designs that I came up with for these banners. They are a little bit more striking, and in some ways I wish that I did as well on these in my later armies, like the Warhammer Fantasy, as these 40k ones, because some of them turned out nice. You see, this is a great model. Just classic old orc in power armor. And he is standing on one of those conical beaky Space Marines, which is really the only reason I would want to paint Space Marines, is for those cool beaky helmets. I was really sad when those went away and went to a more generic sci-fi stormtrooper type helmet, because I thought the beaky Marines were the best. Anyway, that's the color scheme from one of my friends who had a Space Marine army. So, of course, I made it like he was stepping on one of his heads. But I didn't like the guy just with like a power fist and a bolt pistol. So eventually I made a combi weapon on a separate model. You could have Gretchen as part of your boss's retinue. So I made this monstrosity of just a bunch of guns bolted together. I always like shuriken catapults. I think he had a combi weapon with a shuriken catapult. I just always thought those were a cool idea. The clan that we're using are Death Skulls. I'm not exactly sure why I chose Death Skulls, except that I just thought they were cool. These orcs that were specialized in battlefield looting. It's not something you hear about very often, but it sounds like a thing that orcs would do. They're not the brightest technical innovators, so it makes sense that they would just take whatever's left over and use it for themselves. The rest of the boss's retinue, the Knobs Mob, was really just all the guys that wouldn't fit in the regular orc mob. So like I said, when I first got that plastic set, I just glued whatever together, just stuck it on there. And then I found out, oh, you can't just have a whole squad of guys with plasma guns or a dude with a power claw and a plasma pistol. So anything that wouldn't fit in with the normal mobs, I went and painted a back banner once I figured out what I was doing and made them a knob. And so it made a really dumb knobs mob. Plasma guns are not very good. And equipping these guys like this, like look at this guy. This guy's awesome. He's got a plasma gun and a plasma pistol. Not a great option as far as the game goes, but I can absolutely tell why I wanted to paint that guy like that. Anyway, so in order to be able to use these guys without, tearing off weapons and repainting, which I don't like doing, I just gave them back banners. And now they're knobs, and I would either put them in with the knobs mob or I would add them to the boys. Special shout out to this guy right here. Like I said, I was pretty stingy about how I used the bits in the beginning of the whole project. And then at the end, I found out I had a bunch of stuff left. So I went and used it all on one model. I just took one plastic orc and stuck all the stuff I could on him and made kind of this survivalist type orc boy. And I made him my number 2. This is Gacko Lung Cookie. All these guys had names at one point, but I had my backpack stolen a long time ago, and that had all the information on this. And so a lot of this stuff is lost to the sands of time. But that's Gacko Lung Cookie. This gun that he's got, this super, custom blaster or whatever it is, it's not actually a Warhammer 40k gun. This was taken off an old Transformer toy that I had sitting around in the attic. I've actually got a fair few Transformer parts sitting around. You'll see them. I'll point them out as we go through. But yeah, so there's the 2 boys mobs. There's the knobs mob. I wish I had more Gretchen. They're kind of expensive. They were all metal. They didn't have any plastic grots at the time. So I was only able to get 2 of these guys, and unfortunately they're the exact same model, and so they had to go in with the retinue like that. You had several different kinds of bosses that you could have in the army. You had bosses, drill bosses, big bosses, and clan bosses. All these banners, these symbols mean stuff, and they tell me what kind of boss each of these guys are. But that's not so important. Let's keep moving on. Let's go on to the odd boys. So death skulls are kind of nice. You get a lot of odd boys. You get runt herds and pain boys. Let's look at the pain boys first. They help you get dreadnoughts, and unlike vehicles or Gretchen or stuff like that, dreadnoughts were fairly affordable. They were fairly common, and for their points and their effectiveness on the battlefield, they weren't bad buys. So I had a lot of pain boys so I could bring more dreadnoughts. Here's a guy, you roll up your equipment for these people. You don't buy equipment as such, you buy rolls on a chart. So if you want a bionic, you roll in the chart and you say get a metal skull. So this guy had to chop off his head and use the head from, I think, a dwarf from Warhammer Fantasy. This guy I really like. He's just a cool model in general with his little sunglasses and everything, but I sculpted, again, using that gun holding arm. Just took a little glob of, again, I think dental wax. Didn't have green stuff at the time, didn't have milliput or anything. I did have braces, so I used that wax that you use to stick on the sharp metal edges, and I coated it with super glue, and that was my sculpting material. Not a great choice, but again, you work with what you have. I like the banner. Anyway, I just made a little organ that he's just removed, stuck in his hand. And what do we got? This guy's not technically a pain boy, but I just took an old metal boss model, yeah, like that, and then there's this giant syringe that I put on the back. I think that came from the old battle wagon sprue. So conversions like that. There's another one. He had a bionic eye. Going over to the runt herds. I basically painted these runt herds because I could. I had the models. They didn't serve that much function in the army. Here's a guy who made a special base using one of the old squig models. Used a bit of sprue to make the back banner. Here's a guy that got a power sword, used an Eldar power sword. Again, one of those squigs. Again, pretty nice banner. I love their beards. I think orcs look great with beards. Just really cool classic models. Oof. So nice. So weird, so skinny, but full of character. Here's a guy, little snotling on the leg. He ended up with a melt-a-gun. hard to get these special weapons back then, you know? So again, he's got a melt-a-gun. But they do say that Death Skulls are one of the few that can make use of Eldar stuff. Just, you know, they'll put in the time and effort. So I figured that's okay. Oh, yeah. Here's the heavy weapons. So with the old plastic box set, you only got, well, you got plasma guns, but the only other special weapon you got were these heavy plasma guns. They were not great choices for orcs. They were real expensive and, you know, they weren't real efficient at killing infantry or vehicles. I don't know. They just weren't great, but you got a lot of them. So I ended up with that one, these big, you know, plastic tubes that they got. And then I ended up with a metal one at one time. So I really had to scrounge and try and find ways to get better special weapons for my guys. And, you know, you could get like a pack of orky heavy weapons. Like here's the heavy bolter, just this giant thing. So that was expensive, which is not great because the heavy bolters, they were good, but they were very cheap. Here's a melt-a-gun. I didn't bother to have the guy actually hold the handle because I was lazy. They don't weight real well either. Using these on the plastic models, a real heavy gun on a real light model is not great. Imperial Guard had great choices for heavy weapons. Here's an Imperial Guard heavy bolter just stuck on an orc body. Those are great. Another one right here, but they're missile launchers. The missile launchers were a good choice, and just so orky. Just this little smiley missile on this one. I painted them up different ways, but I got a couple of those guys. So yeah, I don't assign these to particular mobs. I've just got a collection of them, and I just put them in with the mob that I think needs a particular heavy weapon like that. Again, like that. The darker skin tone. Yeah. Oh, here's my weird boy. Eventually got one of those. Really stands out. I really like the yellow to contrast with the rest of the darker tones on here, and I really like the banner. So that's that guy there. And I used just regular plastic orcs, just the slightly different color scheme for the minders. You had these special guys that would drag your weird boy into battle, and it was hard to get the metal models, so I just used regular plastic guys, and I just mirrored their pose, and I just have them like that. So that's my weird boy. Oh, tin boys. Tin boys are amazing. These are orc robots, and orc robots, the old models, the idea is that they make their robots to make fun of other armies. So here's their Eldar tin boy, and here is the Space Marine tin boy. And again, these are painted up to copy the color schemes of my opponent's armies. So you got my roast chicken for their Imperial, what is this? Humium Scummius. Yeah, I love the bit from the books about tin boys that orcs think that this is a particularly good joke to have these dumb robots that you had to program like a turn or two in advance, and then they would follow the instructions on the next turn. So they were frequently really, really dumb and would just sort of wander around in circles in the middle of the battlefield. Also, they had an order that I would generally use, which is shoot anything not green, which works out great, you know, if you're orcs and you're worried about your tin boys shooting your own guys. But it did mean that for some reason, my opponents ended up with green color schemes for all their models. It's amazing how many green armies we had in that old 40k group. So moving on, we've got my 3 Mech Boys. Mech Boys were really important. They allowed you to bring vehicles and tin boys and stuff like that. And they were kind of had access to cool equipment just in general. Here's a plastic orc boy that I, for whatever reason, I glued a Space Marine Power Fist on one side and an Orc Power Fist on the other side. And so the only thing I could figure to use this guy for was, say he had a bionic arm and a power claw. So I just made him a mech boy, even though he's just kind of a regular plastic guy. But yeah, that's what I did. I eventually got my hands on some other metal guys. So these are actually from a different clan because Death Skulls are only allowed 1 mech boy. So here we got one with, what is that, Melt-a-Gun, something like that. And here's another one with a bionic eye and a bolt gun. And these are from the Drippy Blade clans. So I decided I was just going to rename all my clans. So instead of Death Skulls, we're going to call ourselves Explosive Phlegm. Instead of Blood Axes, we were going to call these guys the Drippy Blades. No one really likes the Drippy Blades. They don't trust them. They use too much human stuff. They're too close to the Imperium. But they are in our army. So we've got the old plastic ones, right? But before they made those, they made these guys. These really old metal one-piece Ork boys, which are just fantastic. They're just tremendous. Just got their little caps and everything. I thought they looked different enough from the other guys that they would easily be differentiated as being from another clan. And so I got the purple color with them. I got the old heavy bolter that came with that group. So these actually are reasonably well equipped. I knew a little bit more about the rules when I went there and made these guys. Also, here's another, old Imperial heavy bolter. Totally makes sense for the Drippy Blades. And yeah, that's them. For the final mob in the army, we just got some regular boys. And so these are, again, really old models from the Explosive Phlegm tribe. And they just look a little bit more heavily armed. So in the rules, I believe, the Death Skulls could get power armored orcs, or ard armor, or whatever it was called, combined with flak armor. And if you can see, these guys got like this kind of fancy-ish looking armor, and they got the flak armor on the back, that kind of quilted look to it. And so power armor is real questionable as to how good it is. It's a 4+ save back in those days, and you had lots of save modifiers. So it didn't do a whole lot. It didn't make a lot of sense to equip your guys with it. But flak armor on top of it gave you a 3+ save, and all of a sudden that's actually looking pretty good. So we got a group of those guys. They got a heavy weapon with an autocannon. That was a real late addition on my part, but I am really happy with them because, again, just look at these stumpy looking idiots. These squigs actually used for a scenario had a different idea for playing different sorts of games. They don't actually go in the army, but I did paint them up, and so I just kind of included them here. All right, let's talk about other stuff. Let's talk about vehicles and freebooters. Vehicles were really, really good in the old edition of the game. They were really powerful, really good use of your points, but they were expensive. They were hard to get a hold of. Here's a good example. This is one of my favorite vehicles of all time, the Scorcha. It's just a war track with a big Scorcha gun, a flamethrower, heavy flamethrower on the back. And it's just a funny model, and it was real effective in game. And if you really wanted to play this well, you'd be loading up on stuff like this. But of course, I couldn't afford it. In fact, this one I got secondhand, and it was missing the top of the Ork driver. So I had to kind of make my own Ork drivers. These posed all weird. And actually, I was out of torsos at that time. So this is, again, more of that dental wax that I just sort of globbed together to make a torso. You know what? I did the best I could with what I had. And he got lots of use. And I do like the paint job, but you kind of had to smash stuff together. Dreadnoughts are also fantastic, real effective use of points. Let's talk about them in order of the way I painted them. Here's my first one, and again, more dumb humor. But first off, just look at these goofy little pods that you got. So adorable. Not like the big metal monstrosities they have now. Of course, these are actually metal. The new ones are plastic. But this here is Robogrot. What does it say down here? Part gubbins. Part gubbins. Part guts. All grot. There we go. Absolutely great. 2 las cannons. The bigger ones. So there's there are two kinds of dreadnoughts in the old days. You need a pain boy to field a dreadnought. There was no problem. We had lots of pain boys. And you had 2 different types. You had the smaller ones with a gun and a claw, generally, or 2 arms, and you had the big ones with 4 arms. And so in the beginning, I painted 2 big ones and 2 small ones. I just use all the colors on this one, apparently. I do like the banner. I used a little orc hand. Anyway, I forget what this guy's name was. Something Kill Can or something like that. Who knows? But what did he have? A las cannon, a flamer? Sure, why not? But the one I liked best was this little stumpy guy that I put a shark fin on the top of for who knows what reason. Did I call this guy Jaws? I don't even remember. But yeah, he's got a shark fin on the back banner, the teeth with the explosive phlegm, and a couple skulls just thrown in. And he's got a heavy bolter and a flamer. So, well, originally this guy was just a two-armed one. So he just had the heavy flamer and a claw, and I'd just run him up the field to try and tear people apart. Just imagine this stumpy little peanut of a shark coming at you. Terrifying. Anyway, in second edition, I think the rules changed, and you can no longer field the two-armed variety of the dreadnoughts. It's just four-armed variety. So I actually cut this guy up and stuck the middle section in there, gave him another claw and a heavy bolter. And the same thing with this guy over here. That guy I didn't cut in half. Because I had this complicated paint job on him, right? I had these little flames going along the middle. And so I just stuck more arms. And so this is my super shooty dreadnought. What do we got? An Orky las cannon, an Imperial las cannon, and a heavy bolter. Yep, sure, why not? So there's a 3-gun variety. Of course, then later on, they made it so you could have killer cans, the two-armed variety again. So it kind of wasted my time, but I guess for all the usage I got out of these, it really doesn't matter. Here, let's talk about these. The old plastic battle wagons. Look at how adorable these things are. They're just these little hot rod transportation vehicles, open-topped. Look at this engine in the back. So neat. You know, dirt cheap, hard to get a hold of, difficult to paint. And look at how few guys they hold. This is how it comes, right? This is the one I used for my war boss and his knobs. And you can't hardly fit anyone in there. Look at all the room for the wheels and the engine. I added a couple Blood Bowl snotlings on here. Just an adorable vehicle kit. Not practical at all. I kind of extended these little sideboards so I could put guys on the sides. The rule was you could put as many orcs on these things as you wanted to. You could pile up as many as you liked, but if they fell off during the game, they were treated as though you had fallen off in the game, you know, so they took a hit. So eventually I got pretty good at being able to hook arms and stuff into things like the banner pole and stuff so that they would actually stay on while I moved it around. But in order to help with that whole process, the second battle wagon that I made is called the Weird Wagon here. The concept behind this is that when you had a weird boy, the orcs behind him made him stronger. So I thought, what if I put my weird boy in front, like in this little, dozer blade, bucket in the front in a battle wagon, and that would help protect him a little bit, and I could just pile in a ton of orcs behind him, and so it would generate a whole lot of power. That was the thinking behind this. I'm not even sure if it's legal. What did I do? Isn't the weird boy supposed to be in the mob, the war boss's retinue? I don't even remember. I don't think it worked all that great, but that was the concept behind it. So here we have my British double-decker tour bus of a battle wagon. This is just some kind of cardboard that I stuck around here and made a very crude extra level with some of the bits. These ladders here are Legos, and yeah, that's the thing. Fun, a little primitive, but fun. Oh, and finally, I'm bummed that I didn't explore that book as much as I could have. The Freebooters book is fantastic. So there's 2 books for Rogue Trader for Orcs. There's Here We Go, which explained the general orc rules, as well as 3 of the clans. And then there was Freebooters, which had all these mercenary regiments. Just crazy, crazy stuff that's absolutely hilarious. One of them was the Possessed Weird Boy, and for whatever reason, I wanted one of those. So I had this skull throne from some other manufacturer. I don't even know where it came from. And I made a little palanquin for him from Blood Bowl goblins and pieces of wire. And I chopped him apart and sat him down here, gave him a little whip. Again, just wire painted in little segments. So nothing terribly sophisticated. And then you have to roll to find out what kind of demon has possessed your weird boy. And I rolled a flesh hound, so that's the reason for that banner there. It gives him a little crest and some eyes. Not necessarily what I would have chosen myself, but whatever. It was fine. It's just ridiculous. I don't remember this guy doing much significant on the battlefield, one way or the other. But I have him, and he's painted, and I think he's fabulous. Oh, and then the last thing. Okay, the big thing. So like I said, vehicles were great, but they were expensive unless you went and made your own. And they gave you rules for just making your own. You had some really cool ones. Like this is the Gobsmasher, I believe, just a general enclosed orc tank. They gave you templates to cut out the sections of it and make wheels, and it's all just made out of thick cardboard. This is PVC pipe. These hatches are shields from Warhammer Fantasy. And then, yeah, and the rivets are all just bits of sprue. They give you round sprue instead of the trapezoid shaped stuff like they do now, so it worked out great. It's crude. It's not a great model. It's not something I necessarily would be happy with producing nowadays, but it has its charm of the time. And again, I do like that banner. That is just graphically dramatic. And again, the mucus and the fire combined. And these, of course, are guns that I sawed off of my old Transformers toys. I think the exhaust pipe in the back is the exact same thing. And so that's the army. I will just quickly point out some of the terrain pieces. We had a bunch of terrain pieces. Most of them were bad, and none of them really survived. An example of that era were these. We had this sandy desert table, so I decided I just need to make a bunch of cacti, and so I sculpted these just really crudely out of just general clay. I just globbed them into these rough shapes and cut lines down them and paint them green. You can see the Adobe color where some of the paint is chipped because they're extremely fragile and they would tip over all the time and I'd have to re-glue them. Here's another one. I've got probably, 20 of these upstairs. I just thought I'd show you. These pieces came much later, when we're trying our scenario-driven stuff. And so here's a little watchtower. I had a much darker painting style at that time. So it's just little bits of mesh and I-beams and sprue. This is just cardboard. Little watchtower for the orcs with an orky skull on it. Orks in 40k at that time, they had these kind of cool Adobe buildings, just these basic boxy shapes you made out of foam board. This was a prison that I had constructed for a scenario. Little flag on the top. There's bars on the windows. The idea was the one team was going to try and rescue a prisoner of theirs. I used this cardboard for the base, which I learned not to do because it warped like crazy and it wasn't a good choice. Should use hardboard. But it is, can open it up and ladder inside, which isn't a great idea for letting your prisoner go out, but I guess that's what the spiky stuff on the roof is for. Other little terrain pieces just made of bits and bobs. Here's a little squid cave I made out of rocks, a little sculpted mushroom, just a little bit of plastic pipe I found somewhere, a little empty cage from plastic grating, mushrooms I sculpted and painted up. This was a Dreadnought power console just made out of bits. The idea was that there was a Dreadnought that was recharging and the other team was going to try and destroy it before it got up to full strength. But there is the army. Thanks for bearing with that long ramble, that long trip down memory lane. Leave a comment below if you have any questions, observations, concerns. 40k, it was quite the game at the time, and it influenced everything that came afterwards, and I'm really happy with it. And it is fun to pull this stuff out. It was covered with a thick layer of dust. You could actually see it getting blown off. I bought a thing of canned air and sprayed it all down. Even that didn't do the trick. I had to take a big paintbrush to brush all the dust off. But it's good for these guys to see light every once in a while and be out center stage on the gaming table again. Thanks for watching. I will see you on the next one.